Welcome to Tossing Grenade the Windmills. Windmills.
Freight had had time to read the manual on the creator. Time was not on his side. No ship would come for 3 months. Once he had learned that the cruise would be his tomb, he had simply given up and begun to relax. He would eventually be rescued, but doing time was a pilot's master skill. It took a special kind of mind to make time pass in the void of space, and Freight was the best pilot he knew. None of it mattered. Oh, how deadly simple existing was. He managed to find a box of extremely stale buns that had a bit of mold on them. Freight put the buns in the microwave with a bit of water. He figured the microwave would kill the fungus, but the smell was absolutely horrible, rancid beyond imagining. The unpleasant odor of the fungus gave only magnified 1,000-fold when it cooked. He drowned the food in some butterscotch pudding Unfood. That made it more tolerable. He enjoyed his first decent night's sleep in 2 weeks. It wouldn't last. He did the math. Pilots had to be good with numbers, and all it took was a simple examination of the calories. His minimum requirements for survival were 1,000 calories a day, 800 for a short period of time. He had approximately 3,500 calories worth of real food left. With 75 days to go, that meant he only had 50 calories a day. That wasn't going to work. Basically, by finding the bread, he'd managed to buy himself another week. Freight had to find food, somehow, anyhow, anywhere. His movements were lethargic now. He had to conserve energy, as much energy as possible. He had disabled the gravity on the ship to make himself weightless. It would do horrible things to his bones, but right now he didn't care about that. Plus, he had all the calcium a man could want, and the finest medical bay you'd ever find aboard a spaceship. He found a file that listed all the components of the ship, and realized that the captain allowed himself a few luxuries, given his clientele. He almost couldn't believe his luck. Slowly, with carefully choreographed movements, he made his way to the front of the ship, and entered the captain's cabin. His eyes riveted straight on the object of his salvation, a leather chair. The file had said something about chemicals in the tanning process being toxic, but the medbot would take care of that. Right now, if it had the calories, he'd eat it. Just to be on the safe side, though, he'd focus on the stuffing inside of the leather for now. After a few minutes, he began to sweat. He couldn't afford sweat, but plunging the thick leather knife into the chair to get all its insides had been more work than he had thought. He stopped. He couldn't go on like this. He had to think smarter. If only they had a damn robot. And then he realized that they did have a robot, a rather sophisticated one at that. He'd seen it on the ship's manifest. He walked fast, down to the control room and activated it remotely. It was designed to perform external repairs on the ship, but there was no reason he couldn't bring it inside. He flicked the switches on one by one, turning it on. He quickly moved through the camera interface and pointed it to the airlock, directing it inside. The green light on the console flickered its affirmative. He wanted to rush down the airlock to meet it. It might not be much company, but it was kind of like a person, even if it was only a sensor drone. He named it Bob. Bob entered the airlock and slowly made its way back to the bridge. Freight redirected it towards the chair. Bob was a squat horizontal cylinder with 2 giant humanoid arms which could mimic the actions with great precision of one of the crew members inside. Bob would never have been able to function inside the ship with the gravity on, but here it wasn't going to be a problem. He had the computer put on a holographic interface and carefully moved his arms in sync with Bob's. He opened the door and guided Bob to the chair. Moving the chair with the weight off was easy. He picked it up and took it with him. Then he dumped it into the creator. The software of the creator did not like this. While it was perfectly fine preparing real food, the overrides of the chemicals were huge, and convincing it that a leather and wood were fit to be included with food took a lot of work. He didn't stop there. Since he'd done all this work, he'd managed to convince the creator to mix the leather from the chair into the food itself. But wait. There was wood in the chair. Cellulose. Eureka. The computer was dubious about any calories that he might have, but beggars couldn't be choosers. He'd take what he could get. The final hurdle was convincing the damn computer that he didn't need to do a corresponding amount of exercise to make up for the calories he was consuming. Subject 502, the computer's way of referring to him, is not an authorized crew member. Subject 502 must not be allowed caloric profit. That was about as close as the computer ever came to swearing. He hadn't been able to convince it that he was a crew member. Since this was essentially a prison ship for fat people, the security protocols were ridiculous. But he was able to convince the crew had given him a temporary waiver. Subject 502 was given temporary waiver for good behavior. Congratulations, Subject 502. God help him if he ran out of waivers. Chair beef stroganoff it was, and it was delicious. That gave him another 200 calories a day if he was very careful and used the medical bay properly. He still had to find more calories, but where there was a chair, there might also be hidden surprises. He had Bob begin a low sweep of the area using chemical sensors to look for organic molecules. It followed a slow spiral pattern to increase its efficiency. Bob wasn't designed for this kind of thing, but most drones used the same operating system, which means getting them to do unconventional things wasn't all that hard. In the meantime, Freight continued to examine the ship's data stores for ideas on how to stay alive. If this had been a normal ship, the hydroponics section would have been a veritable utopia of ideas. But since it didn't have a traditional hydroponics setup, he'd have to make do. Instead, they had some kind of fungus. But wait, fungus might be edible. He read up on it, and it appeared that it was a bioengineered organism specifically designed to be incompatible with the human digestive tract. Ridiculous! If only the wealthy hadn't been so damn determined to stay fat at any cost. This was impossible. Freight slammed his hand on the computer in frustration, and as a result threw himself across the room and smashed the back of his... Freight woke up slowly. His head was killing him, and he was covered in blood. His first thought was not, "Oh God, I'm going to die," but, "I can't afford to lose these calories." He moved over to the ship medbay and lay down on it. He knew it was good before, but when a series of robotic arms came out and began to administer local anesthetic, clean and disinfect the wounds, and then seal the wound with temporary stitches, he was truly impressed. His immediate second thought was whether or not any of the drugs inside the medbay might be consumable. But he wasn't going to be exploring anything right away. He made a mental note to hook the ship's computer up to his comm so he could access it from anywhere when he was done. As he lay there longer, he began to feel more and more nauseated. Was there something wrong with the medicine the machine had given him? He felt something build in the bottom of his stomach, and his GAD reflex began to kick in. He stubbornly refused to release it. He needed those calories, but in the end, he couldn't help but hurl into the waiting tube the medbay happily provided him. He had a toxic reaction to the chemicals in the leather, of course. He briefly considered where the vomit went. Maybe he could feed it back into the Creator? The thought made him hurl again into the tube provided by the medical bay. He laid his head down. He was going to die. He just had to accept the fact that he was going to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. He had plenty of anesthetics here. It would be a simple matter of telling the machine, well, no, that probably wouldn't work, but this was a prison ship, not a sanitarium. Hell, the airlock would do if he needed it. For a few moments, he morbidly thought about the most efficient way of doing it in a way that would be painless. The more analytical part of his mind kept returning to the vomit. However, he couldn't think of that either. With the Creator, he might reclaim those calories and it would taste delicious. He kept hurling into the tube even when there was nothing left to hurl. He wanted to die. Even the thought of taking revenge on the blob wasn't enough to keep him going. And the ship's captain's life was a lonely one. It wasn't really like anyone would miss him when he was gone. And yet, despite the circumstances, he couldn't give up. Not until he absolutely had no other choice.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Thomas Ricks. Music by Melanie Ricks. Voices by Skip Huffman and Josie Bergen-Lawson.
Copyright 2015, Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC. All products available on Amazon.com and other markets.
To fight the forces of evil!